Before we get into our continued study of the political developments of what's going on in the European Middle Ages, we're going to take a quick left turn and talk about one of the most important things that happens during this time period for a lot of different reasons, the Black Death, or sometimes referred to as the Great Mortality. The Black Death was a disease that struck Europe between 1348 and 1351 that killed between one third and one half of the population. Now, there's two different fractions there because of the more and more research that's being done. And again, different historical arguments amongst historians. The one third number is the agreed upon number, the low end number that all historians agree upon, that this killed one third of the population of Europe. That's going to be the fraction you're going to need to know on your quiz. That's the fraction on your final exam. So hints, winks, and nudges there. As more and more studying is being done on this and more research and different approaches are being taken, that number is being reevaluated. And certain historians are working their way towards that one half number. And that's the entire population of Europe. So that's the average overall. So there's some places that are hit a lot worse. There's some places that are hit at not as bad. But again, I always say it wouldn't be surprise me when your kids or even your grandkids are learning about the Black Death. They're going to have to study the one half number as that number continues to rise. But again, one third, one out of every three people in Europe was killed by this disease in this time period. The cause of the disease is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which causes bubonic plague, when this was spread by fleas from infected black rats to humans. So the bacterium that causes the disease is the Yersinia pestis, and the vector that spreads this bacterium from one organism to another is fleas from rats to humans. Obviously, we're going to be spending most of the lecture today talking about how the Black Death had profound effects on European society, and it's definitely something that you should know for your quiz in your final exam, the effects the Black Death had on Europe. So what we see here on the left is a flea. Fleas drink blood, and so what we see here is a flea infected with the Yersinia pestis bacterium. This is carried by black rats, and so these rats are migrating with humans and with goods and trades from Europe, from Asia over into Europe, and are going to be replacing the European brown rat. And so that's kind of how they're doing it. We'll talk a little bit more in this. But what we see here is that when a flea goes and drinks the blood of an infected rat, that bacterium then gets inside the flea's body. And what we see here is this dark area is the bacterium replicating inside the body of this flea. When this flea then goes try to bite either another rat or a human, it can't suck any blood, so it's going to regurgitate that what's the stomach contents into the blood of the organism it's feeding on, and that's how that bacteria is then transferred from one animal to the flea back to another animal. This magnified, obviously, a couple thousand% is the bacterium, and it's this small bacteria that's going to be causing all the terrible, horrible things that we're going to be seeing today. So bubonic plague obviously can go from rodents to rodents and very much stays in the rodent population, except for when we have extreme circumstances where the bacterium is killing a lot of these rodents, these rats. So remember, it doesn't really affect the flea all that much, but when all these rats start dying, that means the fleas need some other place to go. And if all the cats and the dogs start dying, they're eventually going to go to humans. So the rats carrying the plague bacteria are fed on by the fleas. When the fleas can't find anything else to feed off of it, it looks for a new host. While it's looking, that bacteria is multiplying inside the flea's abdomen. It goes and bites the human, regurgitates that bacteria so it can suck the fresh blood. Now that human is infected to do that. So what should be looking for in a person that is then infected by this bacterium? So the initial symptoms are similar to other diseases: high fever, headaches, body stiffness, chills, pain, nausea, vomiting, your flus, your COVIDs, okay, so something like that. Now, something that is a little bit different, one of my favorite symptoms is that you just get a sense of impending doom, all right? Something that, oh, I don't feel good, but I also just doesn't feel like this is going to end well for me. The distinguishing characteristic of the bubonic plague is what's called the bubo, and this is an egg to apple-sized lymphatic swelling caused by bacteria accumulation in a lymph node closest to the bite, usually in the groin, armpits, or neck. So let's break that down. What does all that mean? So the bubo here is, again, it's a swelling. So think about your neck, your groin, your armpit. Take about a fist. All right, it's maybe a pretty good sized apple. Put that in your neck. Put that in your armpit, and that's a kind of swelling. This is a swelling of the lymph node where this bacteria, like we saw in the flea's abdomen, where the bacteria replicates in a human, the bacteria, if it's in your lymphatic system, deals a little bit with the with your blood, your immune system, and your hormonal system. When it gets in these lymph nodes, this begins to swell. Think about when you have an infection or when you have a disease inside of you, your body is going to try to fight that off. It helps fight that off through your lymph nodes. When you don't feel good, so mommy takes you to the doctor. The doctor says, how are you feeling today? And where will the doctor feel? Put their hands on your neck because you've got lymph nodes in your neck right underneath your jawline. And if those are swollen, that indicates there's an immune response going on in your body. So now imagine, instead of it just being slightly swollen to where a doctor can feel it, but maybe you don't because you're not feeling 100%, to something the size of an egg or an apple in there. Now imagine it's in your armpit or it's in your groin, and you got to go and try to walk all around there. So that's what we see here, and that's what makes bubonic plague bubonic plague. Now, this is going to be followed by what's called acral gangrene, the premature death of body cells. All right, your cells need nutrients and food in order to live. If they don't get that, they start to die. And so when your cells die, they begin to turn back. And basically, this is your body rotting, your body tissue rotting off your skeleton. It's not great. It smells terrible. And this black tissue coloring lends its name to the Black Death of the disease title. So just so you understand, this is your lymphatic system. It has a role in the circulatory and immune system. So again, what we see an accumulation of lymph nodes in your groin, in your armpit, and in your neck. So if you get bit in your kind of towards your head or your neck area, that's where you have a swelling. Your torso, you might have your initial swelling in your armpits, on your legs, swelling down in your groin there. And again, we kind of see overall symptoms of plague. You get a fever because your body's trying to fight off. You get a headache. You're not feeling well. Malaise is just you feel, oh, it's hard for you to kind of go and move. We see swellings of the bubo, nausea, vomiting, and joints, aches, and pains. So what ends up happening in the full kind of born stages of this is what we see here from the contemporary time period. So what we see here from the woman on the left and the man on the right are these buboes. And so again, these can be large swellings up to an egg or apple size, or smaller ones like a pretty good sized pimple. But the important thing with these buboes is that these are underneath the skin. So think about like when you get a pimple, that's pus on the outer layers of your skin. You go and you pop it and it hurts a little bit, but it doesn't hurt. This is underneath that skin. So if you're erupting this and it's popping, it's either staying inside your body or it's erupting through multiple layers of skin that need to be pushed aside. So you can imagine how uncomfortable and not great that's going to feel. What ends up happening then is you receive acral gangrene. And so we see from this guy, his nose, his lips, and his fingertips are again going and rotting off his body as his tissues are dying. In this close up here, and then from this guy in 2012 who had to go to the doctor in Arizona because he got bubonic plague. So this is a statue. This is a wax sculpture that somebody did for a museum in England. And so what we see here is the left side of this guy showing the full-fledged kind of stage, and then this is the initial stages on the right. So we can see the swellings there. But as we saw it, the fingers begin to go, but then those buboes begin to rot and go, and that's what this is. So imagine this is covering you from your head to your toes. You're going to smell it, you're going to stink, and this is scary looking. And this is, again, one of the reasons that drives the horror of this disease is you're taking perfectly healthy people, and this is what they begin to go looking like very quickly. It's not a lot of fun. These are pressure filled. They're filled with pus and blood and other stuff. Not a whole lot of fun. We see the Black Death pop up throughout world history. It's very much the same disease that, again, is very opportunistic when it's able to kind of bubble out into pandemic um, kind of context. So we see three world pandemics of the bubonic plague. We have the plague of Justinian from 541 to 750 AD. This is where we see it mostly in the Middle East and Europe. We have the Black Death of what we talked about from 1330 to 1670. This takes a lot in China and Europe, North Africa, the Middle East. And then we have the third pandemic from 1854 to 1921. And this is one of the last great world pandemics that we see of this disease that takes place mostly in China, but it's going to spread from Southeast Asia across the Pacific to San Francisco, which allows bubonic plague to become endemic in a lot of the rodent populations of the Western United States. We see here, these are a burial plot of individuals who died from the plague of Justinian. And what this is relatively recent research from the late 90s, early 2000s, is that with new DNA research, scientists were able to go into these graves, go to people's teeth, pull out the DNA that's in that teeth, and find that they've got the Yersinia pestis bacterium still in that teeth today. I mean, I'm not the expert on that, only in these outs, but that's what we're able to pull from the plague of Justinian. And then again, we see a picture here of people's shoes that they don't need anymore because they've died in the third pandemic of the late 19th, early 20th century. So as we've seen, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in Europe that's going to set the stage for this disease to be able to run roughshod and rampage throughout the continent. So there's major problems in Europe going on before the Black Death even arrives. Historians of the time period sometimes refer to what's called the long 14th century in Europe, from about 1280 to 1430, where things don't go very well for people in Europe. So you can imagine 1430, Columbus is leaving in 1492. There's a reason why the Europeans want to get out of Europe. First off, we talked about this already. There's overpopulation. There's 75 million people in Europe. We saw the what's referred to as kind of the little optimum time period where we see again an increase in global warming. It's a little bit, we said it was rainier, and what we mean by that, there's no more water for crops, you're able to grow more stuff. True, if you have more crops, you get more food, you have more people. Well, the problem is now we have more people, and the land really can't support all that. And we can see this from the archaeological evidence that as we look at places in, say, the Alps or the Apennines, settlements begin to move farther and farther and farther up the mountains because that rich bottom valley soil is being taken over by people that are there. So people begin to move farther and farther into swamplands, in up mountains, and we can see that from the archaeological record that not very good farmland is being used. So they're not getting enough food, and they're being forced up there to be able to get more food, so it's not ending up well for them. We see the climate is changing in Europe. We see the cooling of the weather around Europe. And so this 1 degree change of climate of where we were giving longer growing seasons, a little bit warmer, things were there. We now have the opposite. So where we had rainy summers, and again, rainy in quotation marks, where we're getting enough rain, now we're getting very rainy summers to the point where we're getting way too much rain. If you get too much rain, water is obviously good for crops, but like you, if I give you too much water, that's not a good thing for you. The soil won't dry out, so the roots can't dry out, so you get root rot, and basically crops turn to mush. You then couple that with very cold winters. Now, obviously, crops don't grow in the winter, but animals are still around. And if you get very cold winters, those animals begin to freeze to death. So this becomes a cycle where you're not getting enough crops that you're growing in the ground, and your animal livestock populations are then being used more, and then those livestock populations are being hurt even more by the cold winters, and this cycle over and over again makes it so that it's very hard on the people of Europe. This is coupled with political instability. There's constant fighting and pillaging that's going on. The example we'll talk about in our next slideshow, is on the Hundred Years' War. And again, 100 years in kind of quotation marks. It's over 100 years of fighting between France and England. That's just in there. And so we have a lot of different problems that's going on there. So before we can get to the Black Death, you have problems in Europe of the Great Famine of 1314 to 1322. This is mostly modern day Belgium, the area of Flanders, a little bit of the Netherlands, northwestern Germany, northeastern France, where you have 10% of the population dying of starvation. And if you know, starvation is not a real fun way to go. And 1 out of every 10 people are dying. And this is 30, 40 years before the Black Death even comes. So what we want to stress here on this slide is that the Europeans are stressed out and are much more susceptible to diseases. I like to tell that we're after Thanksgiving break by the time we're talking about this in class. We're getting real close to final exams, and as freshmen, it's understandable. You're stressed out. You're worried about the grades. You're worried about this other stuff, and so you're going to be staying up late. You're going to be studying, and so I guarantee you, what's going to happen to most of the freshmen that first week of Christmas break? They're going to get sick, right? Because their bodies are run down. You're stressed out, and you're more susceptible to those kind of common colds. It happens to Mr. Cranver every year. I've been playing soccer since I was 6 years old. I do that in the fall soccer season, whether I'm a first grader, whether I'm in high school, in college, or been coaching. What happens November 1st, soccer season is over, my body is run ragged. I try to go and enjoy my birthday, and I've got a cold, like clockwork, because my body's just run down, I'm stressed out, and that's what happens. So luckily for me, I usually just get a common cold. Unluckily for the Europeans, they're getting the bubonic plague. So this particular wave of Yersinia pestis is going to begin in China in the 1330s. It's going to be spread in the wild marmot kind of populations, which is a larger rodent that's on the steppes. Say, think of like Mongolia, southern Russia on the border with China. It begins to kind of be spread out from there. Now, something happens. There's climate change. There's some event. There's some trigger that begins to move that marmot populations from the steppes towards bigger population centers, which allows for more interactions between humans and the rodents. Now, China isn't being as affected as what we're seeing with the climate change in Europe, but they're also being affected in there. So the Chinese in the 1330s begin to have the same sorts of diseases and problems that we'll see spread to Europe. Along the Silk Road and by the Mongol expansion is going to spread the disease as well. The Mongols are pretty smart cookies, so they develop a form of biological warfare where if towns won't surrender themselves to the Mongols will find people with the Black Death and then catapult their corpses, or in some stories, their living bodies over there. They splat inside. Now that bacterium, now those rodents are inside the walls, and they don't have to go and invade that. It spreads in 1347 from the city of Constantinople, the western terminus of the Silk Road, through into Sicily. And there's stories of ghost ships. This makes for a good horror story of ships being loaded with goods and men in Constantinople to sail to Italy, and what gets on the ship with them? One rat infected with the plague, and like a good horror movie, one person after another succumbs to the disease, and these ghost ships begin to sail into Sicily with one guy still alive or just full of corpses, is what some of the stories says, and no men get off the ship that got on the ship at Constantinople. The only thing gets off is the goods and then the rats that go and help spread it. By the time we get to the summer of 1348, the disease strikes Europe in full force. Mediterranean Europe, France spreads into southern England. By 1349, begins to spread eastward to Germany and the rest of the British Isles. By 1350, spreading to Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and Russia. By 1351, it's going to vanish from Europe, but it's going to reoccur periodically about every 10 years until the 17th century. The Black Death becomes a disease of children. And so what we'll see is that this is a disease you'll get as a child. You'll either survive it or you'll die from it. If you survive it, you'll have a immune response. You'll be immune to the disease. And that's why if we get enough children in there to create a pool of people to then have it kind of bubble up and spread. And that's what's going to kind of happen every decade from the 1350s into the 1600s. So to kind of put this spread in a map, we kind of see it spread from the east through the western cities. It's going to go and circle around and then move back. Mr. Cranberry, why is Krakow not affected? Because nobody lives there. The Pripyat marshes are there. It's a giant marshland. It's a wasteland, grassland. No one lives there. So if there's nobody there, you can't have people get infected. So we kind of see it being spread by the trade routes as it moves from Constantinople up Italy through France and England and then through the rest of Europe. Now, like we showed you, and hopefully that's why we showed you all these pictures, is that the bubonic plague as a disease is so scary because of one, how fast it acted, and how misunderstood the concept of disease was to medieval people. We're still having people as we're moving out of the COVID pandemic not understanding how COVID works, right? So imagine how us in our modern 21st century world, people misunderstanding how diseases are spread, and now imagine how people with no concept of the germ theory of disease are trying to understand how this is. Bubonic plague, their symptoms will run their course in 3 to 5 days. So what does that mean? That means from the initial symptoms to if this disease is going to kill you, you might be dead in a week. So people are waking up happy, carefree on Monday, and then Friday they are dead. And so that is wild and crazy where people that are seemingly healthy are within a week are dropping dead. And again, that's with all the buboes and the flesh rotting from their bodies and faces there. Septicemic plague will go and get into your blood, and that attacks the blood. If that passes through the blood-brain barrier in your head and gets into your brain, that's um, it's a, like a, you're, it's 100% mortality rate. You're going to die from that. And then you get an even scarier one, which is pneumonic plague. This is where the bacteria will get into your lungs. And then if you go and you start coughing, this is now not spread by fleas anymore. All right, this is now being spread by people. And septicemic plague and pneumonic plague will kill in 24 to 36 hours. So another way to saying is that people are waking up happy and healthy and then are dead by nightfall, and where they're not even going through a lot of those acral gangrene and bubo stages because that's how fast that bacterium is working in their body. The extreme pain and grotesque appearance of victim contributes to the fear and horror to the disease. In the classroom, most of the freshmen are squirming and moving and covering their eyes when they're seeing those pictures we're displaying. Now imagine that's grandma, that's your brother, that's your boyfriend, that's your girlfriend, that's your husband, that's your wife, that's your son, daughter, right? And there's not a whole lot you can do for them in the Middle Ages, and their pain and their appearance is very much going to affect a lot of people psychologically and emotionally. Hard to know the exact number of deaths. Like we said, please, 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 you're going to need to know, you're required to know that 1/3 number. Understand that is the low side. Localized areas are going to suffer a lot more. There are towns that are completely taken over and murdered and wiped off the map from the bubonic plague. Remember, everybody's kind of related to each other in some kind of local ways, particularly when people aren't moving around a whole lot. So they're going to have similar immune systems. So they could be wiped off the map and force kind of go and overtake some of these medieval villages. We get these stories all the time of your Hansel and Gretel's, of your fairy tales, of these characters in these fairy tales discovering houses in the middle of the woods, which is a thing because of what the Black Death happened and did. So there's a grain of truth in some of those stories that come out that we see being written down later on. 56% is on the higher side of scholarly opinion. Again, the bulk of scholarly opinion is moving toward that 50% number. But again, we're really digging into the historiography of the event. That 1/3 number is what we wrote down and what you should, again, hopefully starred and notated and highlighted on your study guide. This is again going the mortality rate. So mortality rate is the rate that somebody gets this disease and then dies from it. So bubonic plague, basically if you get this disease in the Middle Ages, particularly here for this map from the BBC on the British Isles and Ireland, it's a 50-50 shot, it's a coin flip, whether you're going to live or die. If you get pneumonic plague, that's either spread into your lungs or spread from the lungs. That's about a 90%, 9 out of every 10 people who get that will die from that. and then septicemic plague that gets into your blood, and again, particularly passing through the blood-brain barrier. That's a guaranteed death. It's a 100% kill rate. It's not going to look good for you, particularly in the Middle Ages if you get that. We talked about how people are reacting to that. So what are some other reactions we see, some contemporary reactions? Some people see this as divine punishment from God for their sins. So God is punishing people for all the sinning that they're doing. So logically, therefore, let's do acts of penance to be able to atone for those sins so God will stop punishing us. So this leads to the flagellant or flagellant moment. And flagellants were people who, individuals who whipped themselves in violent public processions to atone for their and others' earthly sins. Stripped down to the waist. So again, they've got their no shirts on. They've got whips. Sometimes to really atone for their sins, they put rocks or nails or stuff at the end. So when they whip themselves, get that blood flowing down their back as they go from place to place to place throughout there. If you're following the logic, if they're traveling from a place where there was plague to another place where there wasn't to atone for their sins, man, we can probably do the math there. It's probably not the smartest thing to be doing during a pandemic. Some people saw this as an astrological reason, a conjunction of the planets. The planets have lined up, and there's laser beams and gods that are polluting the Earth's atmosphere, which why people are dying. Some people felt that the Black Death was caused by poison. People on the outskirts of society, Jews, lepers, and others who hate those nasty Christians are going and poisoning them. And so this kind of view is going to fuel pogroms or pogroms, which are violent mob attacks against Jewish communities, other communities that, again, the Europeans are upset about. Then these are going to break out in Spain, southern France, Switzerland, and Germany against those non-Christian communities. We also see things of fleeing to the countryside away from others, particularly if you can afford it. The abandoning of loved ones, husband abandoning wives, wives abandoning husbands, brothers abandoning sisters, sisters abandoning brothers, parents leaving their kids to die, kids leaving their parents to die. As again, people are trying to scramble to try to save themselves from this very scary disease. So we'll get, these are some kind of preventions, some, again, vegetables, honey, drinking arsenic, taking down jewels and doing that. Some people felt this was spelled by smells. So if you had other smells coming in, like hanging out in the sewers, so those bad smells are in there, or good smells. The Pope during this time period felt that he could keep the bubonic plague away by lighting fires. So he had giant fires roaring all the time and staying in his office to kind of help him prevent that way. Again, one of the reactions is the flagellant moment, where people, again, stripped to their waist and then went from town to town, whipping themselves in their back to atone for the earthly sins that people believe is God's punishment. So finishing up, we want to ask to talk about the effects of the Black Death. The first thing is kind of a simple one. If a third of the population or half of the population or more is dying, what do you do with all the bodies? And so there's so many plague deaths that we see that there's outside of London, outside of Paris, other great cities, which again, there's not that many in Europe at this point. We see large burial plots where giant communal graves are being put out there, filled with plague victims that are, again, being studied and being analyzed by scientists, archaeologists, and historians today. There's tales of coffin makers not even be able to keep up with the demand for how many bodies that we had. In terms of art, one of the effects is we see the dance of death motif or theme common amongst artists of the period, where we see death personified as a skeleton, the Grim Reaper leading, and this is key, all members of society off to their doom. People were very quick to pick up on the Black Death being a killer of not just children, not just the elderly, but of everybody through society, killing the old, the young, the strong, the middle-aged, men, women, the rich, the poor. And so we see here, again, Death is happy. He's got a lot of people. And so he's leading monks, scholars, kings, other people, all to their deaths. And so we get works of art like this, where again you get the armies of skeletons going and killing all these people and having lots of fun there. These I would know, so hints, winks, and nudges. These are the Black Death effects that you need to know. This is what's going to affect what's going on through the rest of Europe. So, and we'll see this on our quiz. We'll see this on our final exam in December of our first semester. Number one, the value of labor is going to go up in Europe. And this is going to make the serfs happy. This is basic supply and demand. So supply and demand can work with goods, but it can also work with services like labor. If you remember, what we see here is that people, again, if I want to go and have a brick wall in the back of my yard, I don't want to do it myself. I'll pay somebody else to go and do that. So I would go to a bunch of bricklayers, find the guy who's going to do the best job for the cheapest, and I'm going to go and do that. Well, if we have an overpopulation in Europe during this time period, that means that there's going to be a lot of people competing for the same jobs. So if I go to a town and there's a ton of bricklayers, I can go and I can find the person who's going to do that for the cheapest, which is going to drive down the value that's going to cost me to build a brick wall. I get a brick wall for the cheapest price. I'm happy. Those workers aren't because they have to keep driving their prices down. Black Death comes, kills, I don't know, let's just say 90% of the bricklayers in town. There's only one bricklayer left. There's less skilled labor to make things. I still need my wall built. Who am I able to go to? Just the one bricklayer. So what does that mean? That means he can charge whatever he wants because I don't want to do it myself, and where else am I going to go? Second major effect is the value of land goes down, right? Whereas the value of labor goes up because serfs can now charge more for their services, which makes them happy. The lords and church, who most of their wealth is made up and tied up into the land, that land is now worth less because there's less people to live on that land, so they can't charge rent to that. If I have an apartment building and there's people competing to get into my apartment building, I have more people who want to get in that are actually in there. I can keep raising the rents. People that are in there who can't pay, they can leave, and I can bring in more people. That's good for me. Whether we talk about apartment buildings or land, it's the same principle. Now, if 90% of those people who are in my building are dead, and there's nobody left out there to be able to fill those spots, the value of that apartment building or that land now goes down. That wealth that I have is vanished. So this is going to make the lords in the church very unhappy. If the serfs are happy because they can charge more money, and the lords in church don't have money to pay that, this is going to lead to the third major effect of an enormous conflict between peasants, serfs, and landlords. The church and the lords want to keep everything just like how it was where they were making a ton of money before the Black Death. The peasants are saying, no, the world has changed. We don't want to do that anymore. You need to recognize that. And so that is going to create a whole lot of conflict. So what we see develop out of it is we see major peasant revolts in France in 1356, the Chambry, and in England, Wat Tyler's revolt in 1381. That kind of underscores this giant conflict. Out of this conflict, and this is important, we have conflict. The result of that is the peasants gain more rights. The peasants gain more rights, and over time, again, serf is an economic term. We see the ending of serfdom in Western Europe by the 16th century, by 150 years after the Black Death, by the 1500s. Russia is going to kind of be its own thing and keep serfs all the way up into the 1860s. But that's what we see out of this. This ends this economic idea of serfdom. People move to the economic term of becoming peasants with more rights that they get out of the supply and demand of their labor from the Black Death. Finally, the last major effect, and we'll get into this on our very last lecture and slideshow on the Middle Ages, is the growth of towns. Traveling tradesmen begin to move around a lot less. If you're a vacuum cleaner salesman and you go to a town that's got Black Death in it, you don't want to go there. So you're just going to go to a place and set up shop around there. We see these fairs, the fairs of champagne that we see in and around Paris that are kind of seasonally set up. Those stop moving around. People go to towns and set up their shop there. If you want to buy Tom Cranmer shirts, you got to go to the Tom Cranmer shirt store in this town. So that then has trade centers being developed around these towns, and we see the growth of towns, which is going to again kind of throw another wrench into that feudal system that people are still going to be fighting about and figure out what to do as even we get into the 20th century. We always have questions. Mr. Cranmer, is there the Black Death around today? The answer is yes. Right? All right. So this map from the World Health Association is getting a little bit old, but you can kind of see it. It still does a pretty good job. Very endemic in Madagascar. 2021, 2020, there was a major outbreak again in Madagascar where we saw a lot of people catching bubonic plague. In the western United States, you can see it's not too big of a concern, but it is amongst the particularly squirrel populations, and we'll kind of see the prairie dogs of kind of the Great Plains. So if you're a big fan of Meerkat Manor and you're driving out through the plains to go see, I don't know, Mount Rushmore, and you're like, oh, hey, can we stop and take a picture and put your arm around them? Yeah, don't do that. You're going to get Black Death or the bubonic plague. So what we see here, and this is an updated one that I just found, this is a map showing the cluster of where bubonic plague cases um, uh, have have spread out from 1970 through 2020. Again, we're in Joliet, so that dot in and around Chicago. Don't be too concerned because that was a lab. It escaped from a medical lab into a person. Do that. For all the freshmen that are squirming and are scared in their seats, this is very easily treatable by antibiotics today. So as long as you catch it in the early stages, it's very easily treatable. But again, as long as you're not like hanging out for weeks on end outdoors or like touching wild squirrels in the Southern Rockies, you're going to be just fine. That's what we're going to finish up for today. And then we're going to swing back, like we said, into the politics of Western Europe with getting into the 100 Years' War between England and France on our next slideshow.